I think of all the things that I've been asked to do this year, this is perhaps the thing about which I'm most apprehensive. Not doing a Bible study, but having indicated that the Bible study should go from 10 till 11:15, and it's on 5 verses of Ephesians. So if we stop early, then it's not being disrespectful to God or to ourselves, although some people's bladders might think it's quite good that we stop. But usually you'd have a bit more than 5 verses. And the other thing is that this is a very extraordinary environment in which, for me to do Bible study. I love Bible study when people are sitting around in a circle, preferably no more than about 40, and where there's conversation among people and people can ask questions. And, this kind of being in a big forum with, a lot of people around, it's just, for me, it's a place to lecture. It's not a place to share scripture intimately, which is what I love doing. And I'm going to eventually come to the 5 verses, but I'm going to I'm going to go a long way in, and it's quite deliberate, because we're dealing with a letter. Now, how many people here write letters? Great. There's quite a lot of us of that age who write letters. Would you say that when you write a letter, you have a kind of idea of how it will be laid out? Yeah? Okay. Do you have a particular way of beginning? You begin to say, "Dear so-and-so," and then what might your first line be? "Hope you're well." "I'm writing to inform you." Okay. This is an intimate letter to a husband. Okay. And towards the end, what might you say before you say "yours faithfully" or "love" or whatever?
"We must get together this year."
We must get together. That's right. And if you were to, if you know that you don't want to put things in the wrong order. If you've got some terrible news, like I'd like to inform you, they were no longer talking to each other, then you might want to kind of cushion it a little bit with saying, "I hope things are well with you and that you're enjoying your new home, etc. by the way," and then comes the substance. And we do that. I love writing letters, and I actually don't like writing emails to friends, so often I'll put it on a file, and I'll send it as a document, or whatever you call it. I don't understand the language, but you put it in a file, then you send it, and when people open it, it looks like a letter, and with the address and everything. And we have a kind of format. We will say, "Begin with dear so and so," and then we might say, "I hope everything's well with you." And then if they have written to you, you want to say, "Thank you for your letter, it's very interesting." And then, having dealt with their news to you or their questions to you, then you might say, "Here's some of my own news," and you tell them the things which are important for you at the moment. And then as you close, you might say, "I hope you're going to have a good holiday," or "I hope next week brings nice surprises," and then the way in which you end, "Yours affectionately," or "Love," or whatever it is. And that's a pattern of letters. We put them in an order so that people can be led into the important thing and led out of it. And when Paul writes letters, he by and large has a way of writing. There's usually 5 things. There's a kind of greeting right at the beginning. "Dear so-and-so," or "my friends at such and such a place. Greetings to you." And then Paul will frequently say what he prays for these people right at the beginning. Not always, but frequently there's a greeting, what he prays for the people. He thanks them for what they're doing or what they've sent him or the information that's come through the person who's brought the letter. And then there's the gist, the main body of the letter, which might be 3 or 4 chapters. And that's to do with a whole range of things, to do with faith, God, the life of the church, and so on. And then he'll end it with asking them to give his greetings to other people whom he knows or he's heard about in their community. And if you go through all the letters, Romans, Corinthians, Thessalonians, this is the kind of layout, almost 5 different stages, and he keeps to it. And it's part of him being a person of his age, when rhetoric, the way people speak in public, and also letter writing had not a formalism about it, but a kind of courtesy, something which enabled people to listen or which would enable people to understand. Now, when we come to the letter to the Ephesians, it has been called the Queen of Letters. I think this is partly because it's very eloquent in its language and because it's quite consistent in its thought. There are certain themes that go all the way through it. But it is what one might call the least rooted of letters. And there are 2 big questions over it. The one is that people are not sure it was for the Ephesians. And the second is that people who are experts are not sure that it was written by Paul. So we might now just finish this and I'll go. But when I realised that, it really interested me. And I think who it's sent to is easier to deal with. Because in the letter to Ephesians, Paul never names any particular individual. In all the other letters, he writes to specific people or mentions specific people in the church. Romans ends in chapter 16 with a mention of 27 names, those whom Paul wants to be greeted, those who are in Rome. 1 Corinthians ends with 8 people being named. Galatians mentions people with whom the Galatians are presumed to be familiar. Philippians comes from Paul and Timothy and names 3 people in the congregation at Philippi. Colossians has 6 people named in the first chapter. Ephesians has only 1 person named, who's Tychicus, and he doesn't live in Ephesus. All the letters end with personal greetings from Paul. He not only mentions specific people, but he also makes personal allusions to his intentions. He more or less says in some letters, tell so-and-so to put the kettle on because he'll be there in 2 weeks. I mean, he does this kind of friendly thing. You don't find that in Ephesians at all. The third thing is that all of the letters deal with specific congregational issues. I was working once with a Canadian New Testament theologian who said that when Paul says, do this, the chances are it's because people aren't doing it. And when he says, don't do this, the chances are that people are doing it. And these 2 words, do and don't, are kind of corrective for what's happening. So the Roman church is challenged, among other things, about its attitude towards the government, because there are clearly some disruptive forces within the church at Rome. And the Corinthian church is taken to task because of its preference for strict dietary laws, and also because speaking in tongues has become more of an outrage than a blessing. And the Galatian church is just plainly stupid. That's what it says in chapter 3, verse 1, you stupid Galatians. And we get the hint in the letter to the Galatians that it's because people have been turning away from the faith which they once espoused and have just been diverted in their attention and in their devotion to God. The Colossian church is distracted because it seems to be keeping up with heathen festivals which should long have been forgotten. The Presbyterian church has had a possible outbreak of fornication and not respecting the leaders in the congregation. And the Philippian church has 2 women who have fallen out with each other, and Paul's asking a man to try and settle the differences. But the letter to the Ephesians has no allusions whatsoever. I mean, chapter 5 in Ephesians deals with kind of good behaviour, avoid fornication, avoid saying the wrong things. But it doesn't deal with the specific issue that you get in all the other letters. But perhaps most reliable about the destination is the fact that comes, not from any kind of, rabid left-wing theologian, but just from the fact that the early manuscripts never mention the word Ephesus. The earliest manuscripts never mention Ephesus. Later on there's a manuscript, and people perhaps thought that he'd written to all these other churches, he'd had some connection with Ephesus, maybe that was meant for Ephesus. But also, in the early church, people didn't have the kind of attitude to copyright which beleaguers people today. If you have to do the CCL license, you'll know about how if you don't do copyright, then we send people from Glasgow down to Scarborough to say, why do you not, that kind of stuff. It's awful, it really is. But in the ancient world, this was not a thing. John's Gospel is the latest written Gospel. It comes out probably into the 2nd century. The chances are that John, the beloved disciple, if he were the author, is certainly not alive when the John's Gospel is published, but it's put out in his name because it belongs to those who were in the community which John was part of. In the same way as Michelangelo did not paint every brushstroke that he ever did, but he had a school of painters, and he would paint, and it would be attributed to him, although they might have filled in the gaps. Arthur Sullivan, who writes The Mikado and The Gondoliers and these kind of comic operas, his overtures weren't written always by him. He would say to students, what the main tunes are, so just put them together and give a bit to the xylophone, maybe halfway through. And it's published as Arthur Sullivan. People did that in the past. They weren't so obsessed about their own name being everywhere. The other possibility is that this is a letter which has been passed round the churches. One of my colleagues, who's a much better theologian or biblical scholar than I, and who knows the languages better, reckons from his reading that this might have been a letter which kind of circulated round the churches, but is probably authentically Paul. There are 70 words in it that Paul never uses elsewhere, but that's because in this letter he's directing his attention to things that aren't mentioned elsewhere. There are quite a lot of verses that come already in the letter to the Colossians. So it seems to be a kind of condensation of Paul's teaching, which has been put together, perhaps with him in charge. But the thing, I suppose, which I have to ask is it really a letter? Is it really a letter? Can I ask you just to talk to each other for a moment? I'll do this 2 or 3 times. So there's no right answer, and this is no, and there's no feedback, none of that kind of thing. Small groups and then feedback, and it's a way in which the speaker can get a rest. No. I just want briefly, if you think of how you read a novel, or how you might read a textbook, if you're learning about nursing or car maintenance, or how you read poetry, what is the distinctive different thing about reading a letter compared to anything else? What's the distinctive thing about reading a letter? Okay, just talk to each other just for 1 minute. On you go. So, do people just say, what's the unique thing about reading a letter? Anybody? It's personal, yes. And your news is given to you, and it's someone you know. Okay. Sorry, what were you said? Unless it's a gas bill. Somebody said?
Part of a dialogue.
It's part of a dialogue. That's right, it's part of a dialogue. Unless it's an open letter to a newspaper. And if you were to read a letter which was not addressed to you, but to someone else, you would probably feel a bit uncomfortable because there's no personal element in it. Now, on one occasion, I worked with a colleague, and 4 months after I'd left working with him, he died. And his mother said, could you take care of his business? He had a brother who didn't want anything to do with him, but his mother was concerned that things should be tidied up and people who he had known should be informed of his death. So I had to go through, he died of a heart attack. I had to go through all his letters, and you're reading these letters and you've no idea what this is about, because it doesn't involve you at all. And you come across things and you wonder, what's that about? There's always a kind of mystery about a letter. And when we're reading Paul's letters, we're reading what was not written to us. So to some extent, we shouldn't expect ourselves to completely understand it because there will be allusions. If you take the second letter to the Corinthians, the second chapter begins, I hope that my next visit to you will not be as painful as the last one. Now, immediately you think, well, what happened the last time, Paul? And unless you know some of the background, which only gradually has been pieced together, and it's partly because between the first and the second letter to the Corinthians, there was another letter which is missing. And if we knew that, we'd be able to fill in the gap about what had happened, which made Paul so uncomfortable. Or in 1 Corinthians 14, as in all congregations of God's people, women should keep silent at the meeting. Well, you think, so what's been happening? I mean, has there been a kind of girls' band in which has been singing irregular songs? And we don't know, so there's a kind of intrigue about that. And that happens with nearly all the letters of Paul, which we'll look at, that you think, well, if only we knew more information, we would understand what this is all about. But in Ephesians, there is no intrigue. It's as if Paul is writing that which is unalterably true, that which is for all people at all times, and not specifically for one congregation, to people who he knows, mentioning local things in which he is concerned. So we're going to move to the text now, and if it can go up from verse 14. And occasionally in this, I'm just going to ask you to turn and talk to each other. You need to do that rather than hear me all the time. And it begins with these words. Now, I might not have the same translation as the one on the screen, but it begins with something like, with this in mind. And what is in the mind of Paul is God's marvellous decision in Christ to declare his love for all of humanity and not just for the Jews. This is what Paul elsewhere calls the secret, and this is an almost obsession with him in the letter to the Ephesians. There's something magnificent about Christ coming not just to the Jews, but to all people. I kneel in prayer to the Father from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name. Every family in heaven and on earth. This is not what Paul had believed before, because we know that prior to his conversion, he had been a persecutor of the church. And we know, I don't know whether you use this phrase in England, but in Scotland people talk about somebody who holds the jackets. That if there's going to be a fight, then somebody who doesn't want to fight holds the jackets while the other two get into each other. And Paul does this when Stephen is being stoned. Paul holds the jackets. He keeps back from that. Partly because he doesn't believe that the gospel which Stephen stands for is true, but also because he's aware that God is becoming spoken about by people who are heathens, who are Gentiles, who are non-believers. And this might be a contamination, a threat to the Jewish faith which he espouses. But that has changed. With this in mind, I kneel in prayer to the Father from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name. now I'd like you just to talk with each other about what does this say to or mean for Muslims and Hindus? Because they're not Christian and they're not Jews. Does the every family taking its name refer to Muslims and Hindus? Okay, just talk with each other. Now, friends, there might be a variety of response to that. It was something which affected me when I went to the doctors about, it must be about maybe 12 years ago. I hadn't been to the surgery for a while, and I went to the doctors and I said, can I have an appointment with Dr. Anderson? And the receptionist said, Dr. Anderson's retired. Oh, I said, I thought doctors waited until you died before they retired. No, the receptionist said, no, doctors away for 2 years. You haven't been here for a while, John. I said, no, I haven't. I said, so is another doctor? Yeah, said the receptionist, we've got 2 other doctors. She said, in fact, there's Dr. Ali, and Dr. Ali has a cancellation in half an hour. Do you want to wait in the waiting room? I said, that's fine. I'll see Dr. Ali. So I go into the surgery waiting room, and I open a book, and I'm reading away. And then I notice this lovely woman, maybe early 40s, comes in, beautifully dressed, and she says, Mr. Bell. I thought, goodness, Dr. Ali's a woman. I'd never had a female doctor in my life. So I go in, and clearly Dr. Ali is a woman, and she's also an Iraqi by birth, and she's also a Muslim. And I'm in her surgery thinking, does God want me to convert her? And I decided that if God wanted me to convert her, there might be more convenient times than when she's looking at my verruca. But it had never dawned on me until that moment. I think I kind of steered clear of how does the gospel and these words of Paul, how does that address people who are not of the Christian faith? And it seems to me that the grace of God and that God's affection for the world and that God's imaging of the divine self in every human being didn't wait until Abraham came along. That long before Abraham and long before Jesus, God loved the world. And God's grace was prevenient, was through all of creation, was recognized in different places, and that God's affection for all humanity was always there. This is not for a moment to deny my profound belief that Jesus is the Son of God, the incarnation of God, the one who reveals God in God's fullness. Not at all. But God's love for the world and God's engagement with the world did not have to wait until Abraham came along. It was there already. And I believe that it will have been recognized by other people who, from their origins, have sensed something of the wonder of the world, something of how love is at the center of creation, something about respect for other people in their own ways. And while I would say the fulfillment of this is what we find in the Christian gospel and in Jesus Christ, I will not deny that the journey that they are on is ultimately the same journey as we are part of. Next week, I'll be working in Toronto, and 2 weeks today, I'll be sharing a platform with a man who is a First Nations Christian, but comes from a First Nations tribe which has a long, long pedigree of Christian, of belief, and also of Christian faith, and also has suffered under the schools which the churches ran in the early days of Canada being a colony. And because I'm going to meet this man who I've only spoken to on the phone, I wanted to read something of the history of how the Aboriginal people in the USA and Canada had been treated by Christian people. And I found this book, which was a recent republication of a fairly landmark book called God is Red, by an American theologian, a man who is totally literate with regard to the Christian and Jewish scriptures. And in it, he looks at the Christian gospel, and then he looks at the way in which Christians had treated with total disrespect the people who they were in among, and how Western imperialism, as it affected indigenous people, was a destructive factor. And he at one point says, unless the Christian God is confined within a Gothic stone structure, it seems that God cannot operate. His impression was that those who evangelized at the same time as controlled and dominated and abused were anxious that people should follow the Western model of belief and that everything else was disposable. And what has happened particularly in Canada, the American Indians have had a terrible time. In Canada, there's gradually been a recognition that there is a commonality of faith belief, a commonality of belief, which gradually people recognize comes to its fulfillment within the Christian tradition. But they can only be won for Christ if their own faith leanings and their own faith experience is validated. When they know that goodness is stronger than evil, and that love is stronger than hate, and that forgiveness revolutionizes human relationships. If they have discovered this, this is a gift which God has planted in human minds. And for us to presume that their belief has been totally irreligious as regards the Jewish Christian tradition is not just to disrespect them, but perhaps it's to disrespect God, whose love and passion and wisdom was in humanity and in this created earth from whenever it was formed. Out of the treasures of his glory, may God grant you inward strength and power through his Spirit. So we'll look at that. Out of the treasures of his glory, may God grant you inward strength and power through his Spirit. This kind of slightly puzzles me, because you'd think that, as with the other letters, Paul might pray about peace within the church, or might pray that they became more aware of the significance of the gospel. But he's praying that they might be granted inward strength and power through his Spirit. Now, of course, Paul's a Jew, and Paul will know that the Jews, particularly as is articulated in the Psalms, have a profound belief that it is the inner person who has to be changed in order that the outer person might be changed. Psalm 32, or 52 rather, has a prayer, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. And Jesus similarly believes that the inner person has to be converted, not just the outer, when he says that what a person does, it's not the wrongful action outwardly which is the important thing. It's the stubbornness of the heart inwardly which is the root cause. And Paul in other places, without denying the need for physical and practical necessities, and the life of believers tends to favour inner renewal. I was thinking about this in the context of a fairly basic psychological insight from one of the ministers who I trained with. We in the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, we have this thing called a Kirk session. It's the kind of meeting of the group of the elders who meet and administer the church. And when I was a student, I was allowed to attend this, but I couldn't speak in it. I was only an observer. And one night, this man, who I'll call James Smith, that's not his name, but he's probably dead now, but James Smith got up on a high horse and he ranted and raved, and he spoke despicably about the church, and particularly about the minister. And the minister just kind of took it. He never responded. He just, kind of went on to the next business. And afterwards I said to him, "What was wrong with that man tonight? You just kind of sat quiet." He said, "Yeah." He says, he had an argument with his wife before he came out. I said, "Do you know that for certain?" He says, "No. But that's what happens." And he was a person who was in a marriage which was really troubled. And if there had been anxiety or dispute which he felt was burning inside him, then other people got it in the neck. And you might know from your experience, as I know from mine, that when something is burning inside us and upsetting us, then our behaviour elsewhere might be rather abhorrent. And we could change the behaviour elsewhere, but it won't go away until the inner thing is really dealt with. Now, I'm going to tell a story about me, and I'm going to encourage you, if you want, to maybe share a story about yourself, about how some inner disquiet, which was fermenting, caused you at some time in your life to be troubled. I found an animosity with a person who I worked with a long while ago. I just couldn't stand him. I found him totally disrespectful. I think that's now a term that's fairly commonly used. Argumentative, dismissive. And I took it to the Lord in prayer and said, "Dear God, please change Brian. Or words to that effect, and nothing happened. I almost became an atheist. Brian was no different. And so I kind of gave up, really. And then one day we were at a meeting, and Brian mentioned something which was the key to unlock the problem that we're all dealing with. And I noticed that. And I found myself thanking him for that. And then a couple of weeks later, he came into my office and said, I know that you're working with this particular church. Did you ever think about, and he named something which he thought would be suitable for that congregation. I had never thought of this at all. And I found myself again saying, it's really kind of you, Brian. And I discovered that what was happening was that if God was operative, he was operative in me, changing the attitude I had towards this person who I strongly disliked, and enabling me to see in that person virtues and ability and kindness, which my blanketed mind had never noticed before. And when the inner self was changed, then the outward behaviour changed also. And for all of our lives, we've been very good friends. Now I just wonder, and this is not for public consumption, but for those around you, if you can think of a time in your life when your outward attitude or behaviour was actually the result of an inner discontent which was not being dealt with. If you can think of that, and if you could, if you want, just share that with the people you're speaking to, then do that now. We continue where Paul has prayed, out of the treasures of his glory may God grant you inward strength and power through his Spirit, that through faith Christ may dwell in your hearts in love. That through faith Christ may dwell in your hearts in love. Is there any other way Christ should dwell in our hearts? I have, for the last couple of years, done biblical reflections with people on the miracles, because it's a part of Jesus' life and ministry which sometimes people find a bit awkward because we can't explain them, and maybe a bit embarrassing. But the miracles, I love them. Every one of them is different. Every single one is different. And there's always deep resonance and deep teaching and affection in them. But one of the questions which now I ask if I'm doing this in a conference or even just for one session, I'll say to people, how many miracles of the 22 which are healing miracles of the body or mind or spirit, how many healing miracles do you reckon require a confession of sin and Jesus' forgiveness before the miracle happens? And I'll say 1 to 6, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. Most people reckon between 8 and 13 miracles require sin to be admitted and forgiven. There's only one. There's only one. And it's the one where a man is brought to Jesus who's paralysed, and his 4 friends bring him. And Jesus, without him saying anything, says, your sins are forgiven. And that word is a word which releases this man from his incapacity to move. And Jesus knows instinctively that this man is someone who's profoundly troubled by what has happened in his life or what he has done. And unless that's dealt with, mobility will not come back. The man born blind, the hemorrhaging woman, the 10 lepers, none of them have any mention of sin. Why should so many people presume that Jesus' interest in healing is the unconfessed sin? Is that within some of our hearts we have this notion that we always appear before God not as potential angels, but as filthy quislings? Is that how God looks on us? Even people who are long in the faith sometimes have this notion that God's primary interest is how bad we are, not how good we might be. And maybe it's endorsed sometimes by the way in which the church worships. I remember the first time I went, and this is no disrespect, the first time I went to an Anglican communion, I had told God how bad I was 4 times before I could take bread and wine. But even before that, when I had a very religious spell when I was about 12, so that I went to a boys' brigade Bible class, which began with a prayer of confession. Then I went to the church, which began with a prayer of confession. Then I went to the church Bible class, which began with a prayer of confession. Age 12, 3 prayers of confession. And one night, I dared to go to an evening service, which began with a prayer of confession. And I thought, what have these good people in Kilmarnock been doing between 12:30 and 6:30? God can deal with our iniquity, but can we deal with God's forgiveness? There's a person who communicates with me sometimes who writes hymns. And he would send them to me and ask, and I know this person, and I know that he's a good writer, and he'd ask me to make comment. And maybe after a year or so of occasional correspondence about his material, we met up. And I said to him, George, almost every hymn you write is a hymn in which you mention sin. I said, do you not believe that God forgives you? And there was this embarrassing moment when 2 grown men were in tears. Me out of sorrow for him, and him because he didn't believe that God forgave him, and that every hymn had to say how bad he was. When Paul writes that Christ may dwell in our hearts in love, this is the dynamic, this is the energy, this is the power which has to be central. And anything which comes between us and the love of God has to be got rid of. Has to be got rid of. With deep roots and firm foundations, may you in company of all God's people be strong to grasp what is the breadth and length and height and depth of Christ's love. Now I want to pause here for a moment and say something which might sound difficult to accept at first, before we look at the cosmic dimensions of the love of Christ. It's simply, how much do you reckon Paul knew about the life of Jesus? Now, I'm not going to take a poll, but I want to suggest that Paul doesn't know much about the life of Jesus. And this can be ratified from different angles. The first have to do with Paul's letters and his mention of the Gospels. Matthew's Gospel is a great teaching gospel. The Sermon on the Mount and other collections of Jesus' sayings, Paul never quotes anything of Matthew. Mark's gospel is the gospel which has the majority of the healing miracles. Sometimes there's 3 to 1 chapter. Paul never mentions a miracle that Jesus did. Luke's gospel is the gospel which is full of parables, and also a gospel which is more than fair to women. Women are prominent in Luke's gospel, and they always, in Luke's writing, come out better than their male counterparts. But there's all these stories, the great feast, the prodigal son. There's never an allusion to these stories on which Jesus builds people's theology in Paul's writing at all. And with regard to John, well, John is the latest gospel. It's not published until probably into the 2nd century. But there are 2 huge stories in John, which must have been well known. One is the miracle of the man born blind, a whole chapter, and the other's Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well. And then John has all these sayings, I am the bread of life, I am the good shepherd, I am the light. Nothing like that ever seeps into Paul's writing. And it's maybe because Paul didn't spend a great deal of time with the eyewitnesses. Paul met Jesus on the Damascus Road in his resurrected power. He never accompanied him through Israel-Palestine. He never sat at the many meals that Jesus had. He wasn't part of the conversations among the disciples. And he did know some of the eyewitnesses, but he didn't spend much time with them. Paul doesn't appear in the book of Acts until chapter 9. And then he's called Saul, and he's an enemy of the church, which has already been established and which already has plants in different parts of Asia Minor and Europe. After his conversion, he goes to Jerusalem. He met the disciples. He argued with Greek Jews, and for his own safety, he's sent to Tarsus. So he's away from Jerusalem, where some of the apostles are. He was visited by Barnabas, a great financial donor to the new church, and they worked together for a year in Antioch. And then they together took money to Jerusalem, and he stayed for some time and went back to Antioch with John Mark, who was possibly Barnabas' cousin. They then worked over Asia Minor. They returned to Jerusalem to be advised by the apostles as how to deal with the claim by some converted Jews that Christians should be circumcised. They returned to Antioch along with Barsabbas and Silas, who became Paul's travelling companions. And then Paul goes on his missionary work in places like Lystra, Macedonia, Corinth, Ephesus, Syria. And he's back towards the end of the book of Acts to meet James and the other apostles in Jerusalem for a short time. So he doesn't have this consistent listening to the anecdotes of someone who has been with Jesus and who can tell him about the poor widow and who can tell him the parable of the seeds growing and who can tell him what happened in the upstairs. But he doesn't have this. He doesn't have this intimate conversation. But then there's not even a mention of him having met Peter, the principal apostle. But in the letter to the Galatians, he says, I went to Jerusalem to get to know Peter. I stayed 2 weeks with him, so he did know him. I saw none of the other apostles apart from James, the Lord's brother. And that's about it. But then Paul has not been called to be a writer of the Gospels. He's not called to be that kind of first stage evangelist. Paul has other purposes. He's there to be an apologist to the Jews. He's there to convince the Jewish people that Jesus is the Messiah. That's one of his principal roles. He's an evangelist to the Gentiles, that he goes to places which have known nothing about Judaism, and he tries to allow these people to know that despite who they are, God's love is for them and God's saving power is for them. And he is also a writer to fledgling churches, trying to explain what the gospel's about, to develop their theology and to tell them how to behave better. He's got different jobs entirely. But that means that we cannot read Jesus through Paul. We cannot read Jesus through Paul. We have to read Paul through Jesus. If Jesus is the supreme incarnation of God on earth, if Jesus is the way and the truth and the life, everything afterwards is commentary. Everything leading up to Jesus is preface. So when Paul talks in these lovely terms about how with good, deep roots and firm foundations, may you in the company of all God's people be strong to grasp what is the breadth and length and height and depth of Christ's love. It sounds magnificent, but it sounds even better if we look at the life of Jesus and discern what the breadth and the height, the length and the depth are. Where in his story are these observations of Paul filled out? I want to suggest that for the depth of God's love in Christ Jesus, that's the incarnation. I was reminded a couple of weeks ago about what was a really quite embarrassing incident in my life. About 20 years ago, I'd been asked by the BBC if I'd care to be interviewed. It was a programme they were making about why people kept faith. It was for the World Service. And I went into the BBC studio in Glasgow and was in this dark, it was a cubicle, it was all black, there was a light pointing at me, there was a camera there was a microphone in front, a sound man, a cameraman, and I was to respond to questions from the woman who was interviewing me. And she said, "What's your favourite verse in the Bible?" And I went to John's Gospel, the first chapter. In the beginning was the Word. And I wanted to say, and the Word became flesh and lived among us and was one of us. And I couldn't say it. I began to cry. It's very embarrassing. Here, this cameraman, sound man, and me, tears rolling down my face. I had no idea what that was about. So we tried again 5 times. I couldn't get it out. I couldn't get it out. And it was afterwards I realised that this is maybe the most profound thing, that God decides, not out of a desire to punish humanity, to tell the world how bad it is, to make a distinction between human life and the rest of the world, the created order, but that God, out of sheer love, decides to plant God's feet in the soil of the earth and to love us back into true being. It's beyond comprehension. It's the reason why in this part of Great Britain, as in other parts of Great Britain, when the Celtic Church sent missionaries, this brought people to belief. Because hitherto they had believed that there was a God. In fact, in Ireland and parts of Scotland, they believed that God even could have 3 different kind of identities. The Trinity was not a difficulty for these early people. But the God whom they worshipped was a God who was above and beyond everything. And the life which they led was a life which was a life at risk, where 1 in 4 women, as at the time of Jesus, 1 in 4 women would die at childbirth, and 1 in 3 babies would die when they were born. That if you were living in the Western Isles or in Ireland, you were prey, as you would be in York, to impredations of the Vikings, who did not come to shake hands with the men and kiss the women, but who came to rape and plunder. That if there was a disease among the cattle, then the meat source died. If there was an infestation of the crops, then the crops died. If you went on a journey by sea, your boat might capsize because they weren't made of metal, they were just made of wood. Life expectancy would probably be for men and women between 34 and 37 years of age. Life was very risky. All of life was risk. No National Health Service, just herbal medicine. And into this world, God decides to come. Why don't you stay in heaven where it's safe? Why come to live at risk of disease, of infestation, of being discredited, of being persecuted, of being killed? That is the depth to which God goes, out of nothing but sheer love. And because of that, the height to which God goes is the cross, where the love which suffers is raised above all other life and all ever other kinds of love. The love which suffers and forgives and encourages and goes the second and the third and the fourth mile is raised above all else and becomes the means of healing and restoration and salvation. And in your own time and in your own space, you might think about the breadth and the length. If we can deal with the cross and the incarnation, perhaps the breadth and the length, perhaps the breadth, maybe the breadth is about how Jesus has this extreme affection for people who are not Jews. You know, if you go through his life, you find that all the time he's being helped by people who are not Jews, that he gets gifts from people who come from Iran, Iraq area with the wise men. He gets hospitality in Egypt, which is not a Jewish state. He gets a lesson in how to speak from a Syrophoenician woman who doesn't like her nation to be called dogs, and Jesus changes his mind and heals her daughter because of her persistence. There's a man who comes from Africa who carries his cross. At that time, people came from India who were Buddhist and Hindu right into Jerusalem. It was an international meeting place. And Jesus is among all these cultures. And the breadth of his love is open to them all. And perhaps the length of his love is how he goes to the extremes in order to endorse the good in people and to win them for God. I love that story of how he's at a meal in the Pharisee's house and a call girl begins to wash his feet with her tears and dry with her hair. And it's a bad idea to ask Jesus for a meal because there's no guarantee he'll behave himself or say the pleasing thing, you know. And so he makes a comparison between the Pharisee, who hasn't welcomed him, really, offered him limited hospitality, although there's a big lavish meal, and this woman who's just a wretch. And he says to the Pharisee, she's the one who shows what love's like. It's just extreme. A woman, and then a woman who's been traded by men, and then kneeling on the ground and washing his feet with her tears. I mean, how far away from grace can you get? And the length of God's love is that what she is doing is proof of the power of forgiveness and evidence of love which God has implanted in all people. Now to him who is able through the power that is at work among us to do immeasurably more than we can ask or conceive. To him be glory in the church from generation to generation forevermore. Amen.